The cameras were rolling, the lights were blazing, and the world was watching when the question that no one dared to ask so directly was finally spoken out loud. A young black journalist, her voice steady but her hands trembling just slightly, looked straight into the eyes of the man standing at the podium, the former president of the United States, and asked the question that echoed across centuries of pain and injustice. Why are black Americans still being killed by police? The room fell silent. Reporters froze, their pens hanging in the air, their recorders still running. The audience watching live on television held their breath, sensing something seismic had just broken through the walls of scripted politics and rehearsed speeches. What came next was not a polished response, not the careful dance of political language, but something raw, unfiltered, and shocking enough to ignite a firestorm across the nation. His words poured out, first defensive, then dismissive, and then something else. An admission wrapped in arrogance, laced with denial, but impossible to ignore. Millions of people watching at home felt their hearts pound as they listened to an answer that was not supposed to be spoken. An answer that confirmed what so many already knew deep inside, but had never heard acknowledged in such a brutal way on live television. Social media exploded within minutes, clips spreading faster than wildfire, every line dissected, every pause replayed, every expression magnified. The network scrambled to cut to commercial, but it was too late. The question had been asked, and the answer had been given, and the world was not ready to forget. In neighborhoods across the country, families gathered around their screens in silence. In barbershops, people replayed the clip again and again, some shaking their heads, others pounding their fists in frustration. Mothers who had lost sons to police violence felt their wounds reopen, their grief colliding with rage as they heard the words that dismissed their pain. Young people, tired of promises and empty speeches, felt a surge of determination that this moment, this exposure, could not be wasted. The streets began to stir with life, whispers of protests turning into chants, chants turning into movements, and movements swelling into something unstoppable. Yet within the chaos, there was clarity. What had been hidden under the surface for too long was now laid bare for the entire world to see. America's darkest truth had been spoken not in private, not in hushed tones, but under the glare of television lights with millions watching. The story of racism in America was never new, but this moment became a turning point because of its visibility. Every nation has its shame, but rarely does a leader reveal it so openly. This was no longer just a political issue. It was human, personal, and unavoidable. People who had ignored the cries of the black community could no longer look away. Their televisions had forced them to see, and their social feeds would not let them forget. The pressure mounted, the protests grew, and the divide between truth and denial widened. Yet even as anger burned across the country, another story was unfolding, one of resilience, dignity, and courage. Families of victims stepped forward, not with bitterness, but with grace that stunned the world. They spoke of love, of humanity, of children whose dreams had been cut short, but whose voices now echoed louder than ever through the streets. They reminded everyone that behind every headline, every statistic, there was a life, a beating heart, a story worth remembering. The journalist who asked the question, once trembling with nerves, suddenly became a symbol. She was praised, attacked, analyzed, and celebrated, but above all, she was unshakable. She knew the risk of speaking truth to power in front of cameras, yet she also knew the greater risk of silence. And now, her courage had sparked something no one could control. As days turned into weeks, the protests spread across cities, uniting voices that had long been separated by fear. White, black, Latino, Asian, people from all walks of life marched side by side, carrying signs not just of protest, but of hope. Music filled the air, sermons rose from street corners, and art painted on boarded-up walls turned grief into beauty. America was on fire, not just in anger, but in awakening. But not everyone was ready to accept this awakening. Those who thrived on division fought back with words of fear, with attempts to rewrite what had been said, with efforts to silence the movement. Yet the more they tried to deny, the louder the truth rang out. For once, the whole world was paying attention. Foreign leaders condemned the racism on display. Global protests erupted in solidarity. And for the first time, America's wounds were no longer seen as just America's problem. The fight for Black lives had become a fight for humanity itself. In living rooms, children asked their parents questions they never thought they would face so soon. Why are people treated differently because of their skin? Why do some people fear the police instead of trusting them? And parents, with heavy hearts, struggled to find answers, knowing that their children's innocence was being stolen by the reality of the world they lived in. Yet within these difficult conversations, seeds of change were planted. Young people who had once been silent now spoke boldly. Students turned their classrooms into platforms for justice. Artists turned their canvases into weapons of truth. The movement was no longer just about anger. It was about vision, a vision of a country where dignity could not be denied, where justice was not selective, and where Black lives were not seen as expendable. The silence in the studio was deafening. The cameras had kept rolling, capturing every flinch, every glance, every tremor in the judge's hand as he shifted uncomfortably in his seat. The clip was already spreading online like wildfire. Millions weren't just watching. They were dissecting, sharing, debating. For the first time in years, the raw face of racism wasn't hidden in shadows or whispered in coded words. It was laid bare on national television. But what came next no one was prepared for. The network executives had thought about cutting the broadcast short, censoring the moment before it spiraled out of control, but they quickly realized something undeniable. This was no longer about protecting reputations or ratings. It was about truth. The Black attorney, still standing tall despite the weight of centuries of oppression pressing invisibly on his shoulders, leaned closer to the microphone. His voice, firm yet trembling with controlled passion, echoed through the studio. This isn't just about me. This is about every Black child who has been told they will never measure up. This is about every Black family that prays their loved one makes it home safe each night. And today, right here, you all saw it, live and unedited. This is racism. This is America. The crowd gasped. Some stood and clapped. Others wept quietly, unable to contain the storm inside them. The judge shifted again, his face flushed with something between rage and shame. He opened his mouth as if to speak, but words refused to form. He had mocked a young Black man on live television, unaware that this man wasn't just an attorney. He was a decorated civil rights lawyer, a scholar who had dismantled discriminatory policies, a man whose life had been dedicated to justice itself. The irony was sharp, and the entire world could taste it. When the broadcast ended, the internet ignited. Within an hour, the clip had been viewed 10 million times. By nightfall, hashtags trended worldwide. Hashtag exposed on Live TV. Hashtag justice unmasked. Hashtag Black dignity. Comment sections overflowed, some filled with rage, others with pride, but all pulsing with the undeniable truth that something historic had just unfolded. And yet, this was only the beginning. For the attorney, the fallout wasn't just about viral fame. He had awoken something larger, something uncontrollable. Invitations poured in from universities, civil rights groups, even international media. But with the spotlight came danger. Hate mail flooded his office. Anonymous threats whispered promises of revenge, and powerful figures who once smiled in his presence now plotted in silence. Yet he refused to back down. If my truth scares them, he told his team, it means they were never ready to face it. And if I stay silent now, then I betrayed every ancestor who bled for the right to be heard. Meanwhile, the judge tried desperately to salvage his image. He released statements filled with hollow apologies, claiming he had been misunderstood, that it was a moment taken out of context. But the people weren't buying it. His laughter, his condescension, his smirk, it had all been too clear. His reputation crumbled overnight. Court cases he had presided over were re-examined. Activists demanded his resignation, and families who had suffered under his rulings came forward with stories of bias long ignored. For the first time, the imbalance of power tilted, and accountability knocked loudly at his door. But the most shocking twist came weeks later, during a primetime follow-up interview. The black attorney was invited back to speak about the viral moment, and the host asked him a simple but piercing question. Do you forgive him? The studio held its breath. Millions watching from home leaned forward, waiting for the answer. The attorney paused, his eyes glistening with a storm of emotions. Then, with deliberate calm, he replied, "Forgiveness isn't about him. It's about us. I don't forgive because I want to free him. I forgive because I refuse to let his hate live rent-free in my heart." But forgiveness does not erase accountability. He will face consequences, and justice will prevail. The world shook. The clip once again went viral, but this time it wasn't just about anger or shame. It was about healing, strength, and dignity. People marched in cities across the globe, not only against racism, but in solidarity with a man who had turned a moment of humiliation into a movement of empowerment. Churches rang their bells, schools held discussions, and even lawmakers found themselves cornered by the tidal wave of public demand for reform. Behind the scenes, however, the attorney battled his own struggles. Nights spent awake, reading threats sent to his family. Days filled with bodyguards shadowing him as he walked. His children asking why strangers seemed to hate them. Yet he remained unshaken. History never changes without sacrifice, he whispered to his wife one night. And if my pain can light the path for others, then it's worth every step. Months later, standing before a sea of protesters, he delivered words that would be etched into history books. They tried to shame me, but instead they revealed themselves. They tried to silence me, but instead they amplified the truth. And today, I stand not just as an attorney, not just as a man, but as a mirror. And in this mirror, America must decide. Will you keep pretending not to see, or will you finally face what has always been here? The roar that followed shook the ground beneath their feet. Cameras captured the tears, the chants, the raised fists, and the faces of every person who had once felt invisible. It was no longer just his story. It was their story, our story, a collective cry for justice that refused to be muted. By the end of that year, the judge had resigned in disgrace. The attorney, though scarred by the battle, had become a global voice for change. His story was studied in classrooms, debated in courts, and remembered as the moment when a single spark of truth, broadcast live, set fire to the lies that had burned for centuries. And perhaps the most shocking part, it all began with a smirk, a laugh, and the underestimation of a black man's worth. Don't just watch, stand with us. Subscribe to Black Unity.